Recently, my grandmother Beryl died. Shed no tears. She was old and lived an amazing life. I was with her at the end. I sat by her bed, holding her frail hand and silently crying. She had slipped into a coma, and the odds of her coming out of it were slim. And Slim had left 10 minutes ago. Right before she left for good, her eyes fluttered open. She looked at me and whispered my name. I looked up, stunned that I could see her fading baby blues, and called out for my mom. My grandma beckoned me to come closer. I leaned as close to her as I could get, and in a tired, raspy voice she said, "I'm afraid I'll see him again." I asked who, but she shut her eyes and laid back down. Her internal clock slowed as her head hit the pillow. As soon as my mom came into the room, Grandma left us. I held my mom, and we cried into each other's shoulders until our shirts were soaked. Not my best day. When Mom and I went through Grandma's things, I told her what Grandma had said to me right before she expired. I asked if she had any idea what she was talking about. Mom was silent for a beat, but then shook her head no. Who knows what was going on inside her mind right before the end? I don't think it was anything specific. Is this related to her moving to Iowa all those years ago? This had been a sticking point between my family and I since I found out about it. My family had been born and raised in Minnesota for generations before Grandma had up and left one night years ago. She never talked about it. Once I learned this weird fact, I asked her. She would always dodge the answer, typically by promising me ice cream. What can I say? I'm bought off cheap. But with her gone, I thought this might be the time to learn the family secret. Why had Grandma left Minnesota? Why the big secret? Who was she worried she'd see again? I knew my mom wouldn't answer, if she even knew, but I held out hope my grandma had journaled about these experiences. Grandma was an avid journalist, but unlike most people, she didn't write a daily musing, like they were a list of things she'd accomplished. No, she wrote them like she was telling a story. More than once, my mom caught me engrossed in a journal instead of cleaning the house. My mom punished me by assigning me to clothes donation duty. She hardly missed a day, and there were boxes of journals in her closets. Her will said she wanted them given over to the University of Iowa. She thought maybe they'd learn something from her daily writings. What life was like for a quasi-radical middle American housewife during the country's golden age. We were finishing up moving these boxes around when I noticed a small gap in the timeline of the journals. The ones from around the time she'd fled Minnesota were missing. I informed Mom about it, and she gave me one of Grandma's patent non-answers. I wasn't satisfied with that response, though. Worse, Mom didn't even promise me ice cream. Later that night, I went looking for the lost journals. I hoped I'd find answers to questions I asked for 20 years. I went through her entire bedroom with a fine-tooth comb and found zilch. Less than zilch. It was as if these things had just vanished. It was possible she burned it. But Grandma had hoarder tendencies, and I couldn't see her doing that. These dumb journals were gone. Out of frustration, I kicked the inside of her closet wall. My foot easily broke through the drywall. I started coughing from the particulates in the air. My spasming lungs would not keep me from seeing the hole I'd just booted in the wall. As I got closer, I realized I hadn't kicked through drywall. It was foam made to look like drywall. Inside, I found the journals I had been looking for. I devoured them in one sitting. A lot of my questions found answers. That said, those answers just spawned more questions. Questions I knew no one in my circle, not even my mom, could answer. So I throw it out to you, Reddit. What the hell happened here? If anyone knows anything about the group my grandma's ex started, please let me know. May 2nd, 1961. I think the Lord just spoke to me. Paul, my loving husband of 10 years, told me this as soon as he entered our apartment. I looked up from my paperback and stared at him, waiting for the punchline, but it never came. He was being serious. I didn't realize how serious until I saw that he had tears in his eyes. "What?" was all I could think to say. "I heard the word," he said, his voice catching. He spoke to me. Paul was not the most religious man. Sure, we went to church on Sundays, but neither of us would call ourselves devout. He'd always grouse about missing the first few innings of the Twins games. The Twins were his new obsession. They'd just moved from Washington, and Paul was worried that if the city didn't embrace them, they might leave for greener pastures. As for myself, I'd been feeling a serious spiritual disconnect from the church for years, and was going now out of obligation and not faith. Not that I would tell anyone that publicly. You couldn't go around talking about how you didn't believe in God in Minneapolis in the year of our Lord, 1961. That's a good way of losing your invite to bunko night. Start from the beginning, I said, still confused. I was closing up the shop, he said, and I had gone into the basement to make sure the sidewalk cellar door was locked. I heard someone say, "I am the truth as clear as day." Maybe someone was on the street. You can hear people through the cellar door, I said. I thought that too, but there wasn't anyone out there. Why do you think it was Jesus? Who else would call themselves the truth? Why would he tell you? I don't know, but I know I heard it. What do you want to do? I asked, unsure of how to handle this. My mother told me all kinds of tips and hints about having a happy marriage, be loyal, make him comfortable, be his biggest supporter, learn how to make his favorite cocktail, etc. But there had never been any discussions on what to do if your husband hears uttering from the divine. I don't know, he said. He touched my soul barrel. I need a drink, I think. That I can do, I said, putting down my book and heading to the bar. He sat on the couch, but he was a million miles away. Something had happened, but I didn't think Jesus made house calls. I gave him a heavy pour, hoping it'd relax him. When Paul latches onto something, it can consume him to the point where he forgets to do basic things like eat and sleep. Jesus Christ spoke to me tonight, he said out loud, but mostly to himself. I am the truth. What do you think that means? Maybe you can talk to Father Jones, I said as I handed him his drink. If anyone else has potentially heard the Lord speak, my money is on him. Paul thanked me for the booze and gulped most of it down in one swig. I could tell he was inside his own head, and any attempt at conversation would be met with silence or anger. I grabbed my book and mentioned taking a quick bath before bed. I left him contemplating his spiritual awakening. I was at a good part in my book anyway. May 9th, 1961. I thought the Jesus stuff would pass, but he still focused on it a week later. He hadn't had another conversation with the Lord, but he did speak to Father Jones. The old priest listened to Paul's whole story patiently and offered him some pretty milquetoast answers. We all hear the word. Make sure you heed it. Following in Jesus' footsteps is not bad advice to follow. Paul left unfulfilled. The following day, he went to the library and checked out 6 books on Christianity and prophecy. He focused on others who'd heard from Jesus or God. I popped into the pharmacy before leaving to run errands. I was surprised to find Paul hunched over an open book, furiously scribbling notes onto a pad. I couldn't help but chuckle. Paul pulled his head out of the book and met my eyes. "What are you reading?" "Book on prophets," he said. "A lot of them heard an audible voice too. Are there any outside witnesses that can corroborate that claim?" I asked, and my old university studies came back to me. I believed them. I wouldn't have a week ago, but trailed off. What happened to these prophets? Some went on to start their own church. Some became disillusioned with humans and fled to nature. Some went crazy and killed themselves or others. It's a mixed bag. Well, thank God you were just a one-off. The thought of living in nature after we spent our savings getting this apartment and storefront makes me queasy. Oh, and not being part of a murder-suicide thing is nice too. Beryl, please. I was going to respond, but he dove back into his book. I rolled my eyes and left. I didn't mind when Paul got obsessed with things. It's part of his charm. But I wasn't a fan of this current obsession. Somewhat ironically, I prayed he'd end it soon and come back to his senses. May 17th, 1961. 2 days later, Paul had to go to a conference 2 towns over. He didn't want to go, said he felt bad putting me out. I said it was nonsense, plus we'd already paid for a hotel room. He reluctantly left, and I watched over the store. I'd worked in the pharmacy before and knew what I was doing, but there was a pall over the place this time. People weren't unkind, but weren't friendly either. It felt like being at a funeral. Later, when I retired to my apartment, I heard something moving in the shop. I pressed my ear to the ground to hear better. Sure enough, it sounded like someone was rifling through things. I didn't panic. I simply called the police, grabbed the scariest looking knife I had, double-checked my locks, and waited for them to arrive. They checked out the store and said a few boxes had fallen, but everything else seemed to be in order. I went down with them and confirmed. They asked about my husband, and I told him where he had gone. They said they'd return tomorrow to talk to him about it before leaving. I watched them drive off when something outside caught my eye. It was the cellar doors to the storage area. One of them had been pushed open. The police would have seen that during their inspection, so I assumed they had popped them up to check the alley and just left it open. I went into the storage room and saw the lights from the street lamps reflecting on the cellar stairs. I hustled across the room and quickly shut and locked the doors. As I turned to go back up, I felt something caress my foot. I jumped up but didn't see anything. I heard a box fall to the ground next to me. I snapped my head in that direction in time to see the tail end of a giant rat scurry into the darkness. I started laughing. I'd been so keyed up that another person had been in here that I'd never even assumed it'd be a rat. The following day, Paul arrived and told me he found a dead rat outside the cellar door. He threw it in the trash and hoped no one had seen it. He told me its head was missing. May 23rd, 1961. He spoke to me again, Paul said. He told me, "Go forth and herd them." "Go forth and herd?" I asked. "Does that make you the shepherd?" No, he said, and I breathed a sigh of relief. Jesus is the shepherd. I'm more like the staff he wields. I keep the herd in line. "Ah," I said, not wanting to show my complete disapproval, but to let him know I have some reservations about this whole thing. Maybe you should start going to church twice a week. Or see if you can volunteer. They're always looking for helpers for bingo and the Friday fish fry. "I don't know," Paul said. "Doesn't seem grand enough for someone hearing the Savior's voice." "Are you sure that's what it is? Not a radio or something?" "It's the word of the Lord, Beryl," he said sharply. "I know the difference between Paul Harvey and Jesus." "Okay, no need to get upset, just looking for solutions. You do believe me, right?" I let the question bounce around my skull before I blurted anything out. A yes from me would be a sign of encouragement. A no would crush his spirits. I needed an old-fashioned Minnesota nice answer that walks the line between both. "I'm just making sure you're not rushing into anything, is all." He laughed. If there was something to rush towards, it would be the open arms of Jesus. I needed to shift gears. This was fertile ground for a fight, and I wasn't in the mood. "Hey, I was talking with Martha the other day, and she wanted to know if we wanted to go a Twins game this weekend." "I don't have time for games," he said. "I want to finish this book about numerology in the Bible. Did you know the number 4 appears frequently in the book of Revelations?" "I need a drink. You?" "No, I need to stay sharp," he said. "The word won't come to a man drunk on earthly pleasures." I grabbed the bottle of rum. I contemplated just taking a long pull from the bottle. But I'm a lady, so I made myself a mixed drink and retired to the bedroom to get some quiet. June 3rd, 1961. 2 voices were coming up from the shop. There shouldn't have been 2 voices coming from the shop, especially after closing. I walked down to the pharmacy and found Paul deep in conversation with a bookish-looking fellow who seemed familiar. They both shut up as soon as I hit the bottom step. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to be as friendly as possible. "This is Chuck." "Hi," Chuck said. "Are you a rep from one of the medical companies?" I asked, confused. "No. I actually buy my aspirin here. He's helping me with the biblical messages." "I love mysteries," Chuck added. "I told you about it the other night. About the messages in the book of Revelations. The number 4 thing." He laughed. Chuck laughed. I was confused. "We've gone way beyond that," he said. "We're discovering new stuff in here that corresponds with the recent messages." "What recent messages?" Paul hesitated. I doubled down and asked again. He smiled and asked if he could speak to me in the next aisle. What messages? I asked a third time. The Lord. He's speaking to me pretty frequently. What? I asked, laughing out of shock. It's daily. I wasn't supposed to tell you. Says who, Chuck? Paul waited for a beat and then pointed up at the sky. I decided to play dumb. The roofer? He said you'd mock me. I'm not mocking you, I said. I'm confused. And quite frankly, when have I ever mocked you? Did you believe me? That's a different thing altogether. Did you know that, historically, the first supporter of a prophet is their spouse? But when a spouse doesn't believe, it causes issues within the marriage. Wait, I said, my anger rising. A prophet? Who else hears the word of the Lord but a prophet? You own and operate a local pharmacy, Paul. How did that make you a prophet? God selected me and I heard. Simple as that. Not to mention Jesus has recently shown me many things. You're having visions now? I asked incredulously. Not yet, but they've told me what passages in the Bible really mean. It's been an eye-opening experience. What has it said? It's a lot to go over. When the time is right to tell you, I will. You told Chuck, which also, what the hell is Chuck doing here? Barrel language, don't blaspheme. Saying hell isn't committing blasphemy. Or did the voice not go over the proper grammar with you? I knew I had stepped over the line, but didn't care. I was heated, and this little obsession was getting out of hand. I mean, there was a convert in my house now. He said you'd act like this, Paul said. The doubts of the unbelievers can cloud my mind. What did the last voice say? You're just going to insult me, he said, which you shouldn't do in general, but especially not in front of Chuck. Fine, I said. I promise I won't insult you. Paul sighed. He told me my first sheep would find its way to me. The next day, Chuck saw what I was reading and started asking questions. Before we knew it, he agreed to help work on this with me. You said you won't insult me. I haven't, I said, biting my tongue so hard I drew blood. I could taste the metallic tang in my mouth. Go on, Paul smiled. I think he's my first sheep. Where do you hear the voices? In the basement near the cellar door. I'm going down there, I said, to see if I hear anything. You won't, he said. I'm still trying. I walked out of the aisle, shot Chuck a warm smile, and headed down the basement stairs to storage. As I made my way down, I heard Paul tell Chuck that I was having some womanly issues and should be fine. I promised myself I would give the prophet Paul a good punch in the arm later. I walked down into the basement storage area and flipped on the light. I hated coming down here at the best of times, but it was the worst at night. It was already so dark in this room, and the lack of sunlight streaming through the slight cracks in the cellar door made it 10 times worse. But I was bound in the armor of a doubting Thomas, so I pushed my fears aside and made my way over to where Paul hears his divine messages. I stood for 10 minutes, not making a sound. No voice spoke to me, no God, Jesus, or Jack Benny. All remained as quiet as a prayer. I rolled my eyes and headed back upstairs to the apartment. I wanted to get a head start on giving Paul the cold shoulder. June 10th, 1961. A week later, besides a Chuck, there was now a Greg, a Dan, a Dawn, a Joy, and a Tom. Most of these people were customers, but Joy and Tom were Chuck's friends. He told them what he and Paul had been doing, and they were intrigued. So they started coming too. They wouldn't be the last. More and more strangers moved through my life. The after-work gatherings became an everyday thing, and their tenor changed. When only Chuck was hanging around, he and Paul seemed to discuss biblical prophecy and the voices Paul heard. But now that a congregation was in the basement, the meetings took on a different tenor. Paul spoke like he was preaching to them, and the group ate it up. They looked at him like he had answers to their problems. He called them Paulites, and they responded well to it. I couldn't get this man to put his dishes in the sink. Yet these people thought he knew the answers to cosmic mysteries. I was floored. Paul never told me about the new messages. I asked once, and he said the voices told him to spare the message from non-believers. I asked him when I had been shifted to non-believer status, and and he didn't elaborate. I tried a few times to coax a message from the voice in the basement, but rolled a snake eyes every time. Paul had been more distant in the last week. At first, I was okay with it because he seemed to enjoy himself, but the meetings started running to midnight, and I got lonely. I tried to go down there once or twice, but he always told me to head up. I'd be bored. I said I was curious, but he turned me away. I talked to Mom about it, and she said it's odd, but most men need a hobby they share with friends. She reminded me that Daddy was a member of the lodge, and would hang out with those guys a few nights a week. What Paul was doing seemed similar, if not more church-related. She said it was good that you knew where and who he was with. I couldn't disagree, but it still sat funny with me. That seed of a funny feeling soon bloomed into a flowering issue when I heard Paul and Chuck discussing how many cots they could fit in the storeroom. I didn't want to interrupt them while they were talking, but I did sit on the stairs and listen. Paul said it would be better for the disciples to stay here. Chuck said he could easily build 2 or 3 rooms with the space down here, if Paul was willing to shuffle around the boxes. Paul said that wouldn't be an issue. He also told Chuck he wanted to build a shrine to the voice. A holy site, he called it. Chuck said that wouldn't be an issue. After the group had left, I confronted Paul. I asked him what was going on and why he was going to build bedrooms downstairs. He said I wasn't allowed to know as I was not a member of the Immaculate Voice of the Lord. I said as the leaseholder of the pharmacy, I had every right to know. I'd contact the city about code violations if he didn't tell me. Paul relented. He told me he'd discovered hidden messages in the book of Revelations thanks to the Lord's clues. As he told people, he found that some truly believed him. The group started as Bible study, but quickly became one that felt the need to splinter away from any known doctrines and strike out on their own. The more formal churches were just parroting back words and beliefs from ancient voices. His church was getting the words straight from the horse's mouth. I didn't judge, but I did ask why he felt he couldn't share this with his wife. Had I not initially encouraged his passion project? Why was he keeping these secrets from me? He hemmed and hawed, but after some more precision-targeted questions, he finally spilled the beans. The voice told him to not tell me. I asked why Jesus would tell Paul to spread the word about his religion, but not tell his wife. He said the voice told him I would do anything to stop the church from forming. The day of cleansing would never come if I was successful. Day of cleansing, I asked. It's the day when the truth is revealed to the world. The non-believers will. Well, that's not important. No, you need to say. He sighed. They die and are sent to hell. You want me to go to hell? No, no, no. I want you to come along with me. But I'm being blocked from including you. The voice says that you don't have enough faith. You ask too many questions. Paul, darling, are you sure there even is a voice? He started laughing. The Lord said you'd say that. It's why I can't preach to you. Your doubt encapsulates you like unholy armor. There is no way to penetrate it. I think I'm going to stay at my mom's house, I said, slowly backing away from him. I need some time to think. Please don't, he said, his tone changing. I can teach you my ways and school you in the education of the Immaculate Voice doctrine. It'll bring us closer both in this life and the next. His eyes were pleading, and I again saw the face of the boy I had fallen for all those years ago. My body wanted to embrace him, but my brain held firm. I'll stay tonight, okay? But no promises about tomorrow. Tomorrow you'll take us into your heart, he said, smiling. I love you. Let's get some sleep, huh? June 11th, 1961, I reached over in the middle of the night and felt an empty space next to me. Paul was gone. I looked around, but he wasn't in the apartment. I assumed he was downstairs, either in the pharmacy or the storeroom. I prayed it was the pharmacy, but I knew where I'd find him. I moved as silently as a ghost until I got to the shop floor. It was pitch black outside, save for the lamp posts that lined the street. They gave the avenue an orange glow that most people never see because most decent people are asleep at this hour. I walked toward the door to the storeroom and found it already opened. A light was on down there, and I heard mumbling but couldn't make out any words. I softly took the first few steps, making sure I didn't give away my position. Paul's voice was still muffled, but I could hear every other word. It seemed he was talking to someone, but I never heard another voice speak back. Then I realized he was probably talking with the voice. I made my way down the stairs and ducked behind some of the boxes of medicine. If he really looked, he'd spot me easily, but overlook me if he just glanced. I settled in and cocked my ear toward him. What I heard from him made the blood drain from my face and my body shake. If she leaves, who will we use to secure your arrival? Without her body, you cannot rise. There was silence for a few seconds until Paul started laughing. It wasn't the fun, friendly chuckle I had swooned over during study sessions in poli-sci. It was maniacal. Thy will be done, Father. With that, Paul shut off the light and walked back upstairs. Sitting alone in the dark, I realized two things. My marriage was obviously over, and the Paulites were going to kill me. I needed to go now. The quickest way out was through the cellar doors. I'd figure out the details later, but fleeing this nightmare was paramount. As quietly as possible, I undid the latches and pushed open the metal doors, stepping half up the ladder to softly lay them on the sidewalk. Before leaving, though, I looked back at the room and spat. Till death do us part, no thanks. You can have him. The air around me becomes charged. It made my skin tingle. From the dark void of the room, I heard a deep voice croak. Your end is here, child. Fuscus locutus est. I took Latin in college and had attended church since I could walk. This wasn't Jesus or God or anything holy speaking to Paul. He was being deceived. Jesus doesn't call himself the Dark One. But I knew who did. As my brain tried to reconcile this information, a bloody, severed rat head landed square on my foot. I charged up those stairs and out onto the street. I ran as far as my lungs would take me. All I heard were my bare feet slapping on the sidewalk and deep, evil laughter echoing from the basement. I never looked back. There was nothing I wanted to see anyway.